Let's talk about what happens when an entire city says goodbye to its savior. Not just a king or a war hero, but the one person who brought light back after the darkest of times. Today, we're diving into one of the most powerful farewells in ancient literature. The day Krishna left the city he had saved, Hastināpura.
And really, this is the question at the very heart of the story. Just imagine for a second, your world was completely shattered, torn apart by war. And now, it's whole again. The city is thriving, your family is safe, and it's all thanks to the guidance of one person. And then, one day he says he has to leave. How in the world do you say goodbye to someone like that?
So to really get why this goodbye was such a big deal, we have to understand just how good things have become in Hastināpura. The memories of a terrible, catastrophic war were still fresh for everyone.
The Kurukshetra War, a brutal civil war that had pitted cousins against cousins, family against family, was finally over. The battlefields had gone quiet, and a new, fragile peace was just beginning to settle over the land.
The corrupt rulers were gone. In their place, Yudhishthira, the eldest of the Pāṇḍava brothers and a true symbol of righteousness, was now king. And with him, a sense of justice and real order returned.
But the true architect of this new peace, that was Krishna. He was Yudhishthira's cousin, sure, but he was so much more. He was his best friend, his guide, his divine advisor. And thanks to him, the kingdom wasn't just recovering, it was truly flourishing. It was on the verge of a golden age.
The source material paints this incredible picture of a world in perfect harmony. It wasn't just that people were doing well, it was like nature itself was celebrating. The rains came exactly when they were needed. The harvests were unbelievably abundant. I mean, the text says the cows were so happy and full that their milk literally soaked the pastures. It was a world reborn, a paradise without fear.
But you know how these stories go. Right at the peak of this perfect peace, the man who made it all happen announces it's time for him to go.
After staying for several months to make sure the new kingdom was on solid ground and to comfort his family, Krishna announced that it was time to head back to his own capital, Dvārakā. As far as he was concerned, his job in Hastināpura was done.
For the Pāṇḍavas, this news was just devastating. The thought of life without Krishna wasn't just sad. The source material uses the word unbearable. He was so woven into the fabric of their lives, they couldn't even picture a day without him. This quote just perfectly captures how deep their connection was. This wasn't about bowing down to some distant god. This was about losing a constant companion. He was there for every single meal, every conversation, every moment, big or small. How do you even begin to cope with that kind of loss? So, as Krishna gets his chariot ready to leave, his loved ones can only stand and watch. Their eyes are just locked on him, not blinking. You can just feel their hearts and minds already going with him down that road. It's such a powerful image of love and helplessness. But this wasn't just some quiet, private goodbye. Oh no! The entire city of Hastināpura poured out into the streets to see him off. It turned into this massive, breathtaking spectacle of love and devotion. I mean, just try to picture the scene. The air is buzzing with the sounds of drums, conch shells, and kettle drums. A huge, white royal parasol covered in pearls is held over him. His closest friends are right there, fanning him. And flowers are just raining down on him from all the rooftops as he passes. This was way more than a royal send-off. It was a tribute.
And speaking of those rooftops, the women of the city are all up there watching this incredible procession. And the text points out this fascinating detail. Their faces aren't just filled with sadness, it's this complex mix of love, modesty, and even gentle smiles.
And this is where the story takes a really deep turn. As they watch him go, these women start talking to each other. But they're not talking about how sad they are that he's leaving. They start talking about who he really is, about his true nature. They were seeing past the friend and the advisor and understanding the divine being inside.
And this rooftop conversation, wow. It shows just how profoundly the people of Hastināpura understood Krishna. They didn't just admire him for the amazing things he did, they revered him for who he fundamentally was.
So what did they see? What did they understand about him? Well, their conversation reveals three incredible insights into his divine identity.
First, they saw him as the original being. Think about that. The single supreme person who existed before, well, before anything existed, before the universe, before time, before space, the absolute source of everything.
Second, they knew him as the creator, not some distant figure, but the one who actively brings the entire material world into existence through his own divine energy, giving names and forms to what was once unmanifested.
And finally, they recognized him as the protector, the divine being who comes to earth in different forms in every age whenever injustice and chaos start to take over to restore balance and righteousness. They realized that what he did for them wasn't a one-time thing, it's who he is.
And Krishna, as he passes by, hears their words, this profound understanding of who he is. And what does he do? No big speech. He simply acknowledges them with a gentle smile as he continues on his journey. It's this quiet, graceful acceptance of their love.
And just like that, the farewell was over. Krishna left Hastināpura behind, but you have to imagine he carried the city's love and blessings with him as he started the long journey home.
And the source text makes it clear just how epic this journey was. He passed through numerous kingdoms and vast lands, Kuru, Panchala, Shurasena, crossing a huge part of ancient India before he finally arrived back at his own seaside kingdom.
And that brings us right back to where we started. On the surface, this is a story about a physical departure, a grand farewell, and a long road. But at its core, it's about a connection so strong that distance becomes almost meaningless. Which leaves us with one final lingering thought. Even though he left their city, did he ever really leave their hearts at all?
Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we're jumping into a really delicate and highly consequential moment, right after a massive conflict.
Right, we're moving beyond the battlefield.
Exactly. We're looking at the first strokes of a new era. An era our sources define by the establishment of perfect righteousness, or dharma.
But that stability is shattered by something huge. A profound sense of, well, of loss. A pivotal figure is about to depart.
And that figure is Hari, or Krishna. So we have this tension from the very beginning.
Absolutely. The source sets it up perfectly. You have King Yudhishthira finally on the throne in Hastināpura after defeating his enemies. That's the political victory.
But the real story, for our deep dive anyway, is this balance.
Yes. The balance between that, political perfection and this deep personal grief when the divine figure who made it all possible says, I'm leaving. He's heading back to his own city, Dvārakā.
Okay, so let's start with the political side of it. The source almost frames this as mission accomplished, instantly.
It's almost shockingly fast. The question is posed, how did Yudhishthira proceed now that the hostile competitors are gone?
And the answer is?
Instantaneous perfection. Hari, who's revered as the sustainer of the world, was deeply pleased. He had replanted the Kuru lineage,
which the text describes so vividly as being destroyed by the forest fire of the dynasty.
What a phrase, right?
It's incredible.
So with that lineage restored, and with Yudhishthira's own confusion cleared by the teachings of his elders and Krishna, he just rules.
And he doesn't just rule well. The source gives us a template for what ideal governance actually looks like.
It really does. It sets an almost impossible standard. He rules like Indra, the god of the heavens, with his brothers supporting him.
But what makes it a mark of perfect dharma, perfect order, is that it's not just about society. The harmony extends to the environment itself.
Right. We are not just talking about, good tax policy here.
No, this is its nature in perfect balance. The rain fell exactly when and where it was supposed to.
The earth provided everything anyone could ever desire.
Even the rivers, the mountains, the plants, they all yielded their bounty precisely in season. It's a literal golden age.
And that leads to the ultimate proof of his success, the complete absence of suffering.
That's the part that's just staggering.
The text is so explicit. It says there were no distresses, no diseases, no mental or physical troubles. None. Not from divine sources, not from the elements, not from within.
So when dharma is fully established, suffering just stops.
It ceases to exist. And that incredible stability, that perfection, is the backdrop for the real emotional crisis here.
That's a great point. If everything is so perfect, why did Hari stick around? Why did he delay his departure?
And he did for a few months. The source gives two very specific, very human reasons. First, to help his friends with their grief.
Just to be there for them.
To be there. And second, purely for the pleasure of his sister, Subhadra. It's this remarkable moment where this cosmic figure is just being a good brother.
He's submitting to the obligations of family.
Exactly. Which, of course, made the final departure even harder.
And when that moment finally came, the source says the separation was almost unbearable. The list of people who couldn't handle it is basically the entire surviving royal family.
Everyone. Subhadra, Draupadī, Kuntī, the old king Dhritarashtra, and all the Pandava brothers, Bhima, Arjuna.
And their connection to him wasn't just political.
No, not at all. The source says their bond was forged through just being together. Constant, intimate association.
Seeing him, touching him, talking with him, sitting, eating together.
Their entire consciousness was fixed on him. They followed him with, and this is a quote, unblinking eyes. It was the sorrow of losing someone who was just always there.
And there's that one heartbreaking detail about the wives of the relatives.
Oh, that's just devastating.
As they're watching him get ready to leave, they're holding back their tears. And not for composure, but out of this deep fear.
They believed that if their tears fell, it would be a bad omen. Inauspicious.
It might mess up his journey.
Right, so they're suffering this immense personal grief, but they also recognize that the person causing it is too important to be delayed or hindered by their human sorrow.
Wow. Still, despite that sadness, the send-off itself sounds like a massive spectacle.
Oh, it was a full state affair. The military band was out conchis, drums, horns, a huge fanfare.
This was a royal procession for a victorious king, not just a relative going home.
Absolutely. The Kuru women are on the palace rooftops, showering him with flowers, watching with this mix of love and modesty.
And the logistics were grand. Arjuna is holding the parasol over him.
Others are holding the fans. And this is the part I find fascinating.
What's that?
The Shidra, the king of this perfect suffering-free kingdom, still isn't taking any chances.
He deploys the army.
The entire fourfold army, infantry, cavalry, chariots, elephants, all to protect Hari because he's still worried about potential enemies out there.
So even in a perfect state, the fear of losing your ultimate protector is still real.
It seems so. And that's the perfect pivot point. Because right as Hari is physically leaving, the narrative it shifts completely.
It goes from military protocol and personal grief to something else entirely.
To profound theology. We start hearing the conversation, the sanjalpa of the city women of the Kuru kingdom as they watch him ride away.
And this conversation becomes the intellectual, the spiritual core of the whole text.
It really does. And what's so interesting is that it's the city women, not the priests or the philosophers who are saying this.
They're the ones who vocalize the ultimate truth of who he is. They see him not as a relative or an ally, but as something more.
The ancient Purusha, the primal consciousness.
They're articulating the very foundation of creation.
They are. They say that before the cosmic qualities, the gunas even existed, when all creative energy was just sleeping, he was there.
He existed alone, without distinction, the ultimate reality.
He's the creator of the scriptures, and when the desire for creation arises, he uses his own energy to establish form and name. He writes the code for reality.
So all of his actions, even the ones that look like human heroism, are actually part of this divine purpose.
But this divine play. And the women use that specific word, lela. They say he's the single Lord who creates, sustains, and dissolves the world through his own divine sport.
And that's a huge concept, right? The idea that he's fully participating, but he's not attached to the outcome.
He isn't bound by the rules of the game he created. He's just playing.
So, if he's unattached, why show up in human form at all?
They answer that too. They say he appears in different forms in every age, Yujuju.
For one purpose.
To restore truth, compassion, and glory whenever unrighteous kings, those whose minds are rooted in darkness, come to power.
This idea of cyclical divine restoration, that's the engine of the whole epic.
It is. And the women just solidify this reverence by praising everyone and everything connected to him. They praise his family, the Yadu clan. They praise his city, Dvārakā, because its people get to see his smiling glance all the time.
And they even praise his wives, the ones won through valor and the thousands he rescued.
They say those women actually sanctify womanhood itself, because their divine husband never truly leaves their hearts.
So the spiritual reality is more powerful than the physical departure.
That's it, exactly. And after receiving that silent reverence, Hari just gives the women a smiling look and finally proceeds. He sends the grieving Pāṇḍavas, the Parthas, back home. The time for personal guidance is over.
The age of Dharma is here. and he has to go.
He has to go.
And so now we get the actual physical journey. The narrative shifts back to geography, grounding this cosmic event in a real place.
It's a serious journey. It's not a short trip. It starts through the Kuru region, then Panchala.
From there, he travels through Shurasena, along the Yamuna River, past these incredibly sacred areas like Brahmavarta and Kurukshetra.
Then through Matsya, and then the really hard part, the Maru Desert.
Right. He crosses the borders of Savira and Apira, and finally reaches Anarta, the region of Gujarat where Dvārakā is located. The scale of this trip is immense.
It is. And the text notes that he's honored by locals all along the way, but it adds this one tiny humanizing detail.
What's that?
It says he was slightly weary from travel when he finally reached the western direction in the evening.
Slightly weary. Even a divine being gets tired after a long day's journey.
That single detail is so powerful. It reminds you that while his identity is cosmic, the work of being in the world takes effort.
So let's bring this all together. What do we take from this? We have this incredible split screen. On one side, Yudhishthira's world is politically perfect. It's a state of absolute justice, no suffering.
And on the other, you have this overwhelming spiritual grief and this profound cosmic understanding of who Krishna actually is.
How do those two things fit together?
Well, I think the source is giving us a kind of template. It's showing that the political stability, the perfect dharma, isn't just an accident of good management. It's intrinsically linked to the presence and the departure of this divine figure.
So authority in this worldview flows directly from cosmic design, not just from human action.
Exactly. The source ends with that powerful idea that the Lord takes form in every age to restore balance when unrighteous kings rule.
So here's something to think about as we wrap up. If you accept that concept, this idea of cyclical restoration, that justice isn't just a political goal but a kind of divinely guaranteed necessity, how might that change the way you look at power and righteousness in the world today?
It's a fundamental question, isn't it? Does true, lasting order come from human systems or from somewhere beyond them?
Something to mull over until our next deep dive.